Greetings to all. The scripture reading from which this week's point to ponder arises comes from the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 to 33, one of the scripture passages appointed for the 10th Sunday after Pentecost. The passage gives Matthew's account of a story about Jesus walking on the water to help his disciples whose boat was being battered by heavy winds and waves. But the story is also about Peter, who gets out of the boat and begins to walk over the water to Jesus when Jesus calls to him, but then begins to sink when he becomes distracted by the heavy winds. Peter ends up calling out to Jesus to save him, and of course, Jesus does, helping him right back to where he needs to be, which is inside the boat, which is also the part of the story from which this week's point to ponder arises. Disappointments and failures can lead us to where we need to be. To ponder that point with me is my friend Tim Miller.
So Tim, thank you for being with me today. And I'd like to start by just asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I grew up in Canada. I was born there of U.S. citizen parents, but Dad was transferred up there with his oil company to Calgary, Alberta. So that's where I grew up till I was 18. And then Dad got transferred to Dallas, Texas. And so I ended up going to college in Texas, then moving to Chicago for graduate school, and taught high school at a Catholic girls' school for 3 years. Really enjoyed that job and had some really interesting relationships that continue till today with some of the students. Then I decided the climate there was too rough, so I moved to San Francisco. After the teaching career, I got into a data processing career as a programmer. And then in later decades, as the internet came along, as a web developer. So I lived in San Francisco for about a year, and then my parents retired to Arkansas, and they were sort of urging me to move closer to them. So I ended up, the job I was working for in San Francisco offered to transfer me to the Oak Ridge, Tennessee office. So I transferred. I was closer to my parents. I did that career for about 11 years, and then I started working for a friend of mine in San Francisco as a telecommuter. So I was working in San Francisco, but I was living in Knoxville, Tennessee. And I did that and then switched to a company in Seattle doing healthcare stuff. And I was still doing programming and web development for that company. So again, I was working in Seattle, but I was living in Knoxville, Tennessee. And then in 2014, I retired. And since then, I've been trying to use my data processing and web development skills to sort of help where I can, and also do a lot of reading and some writing. And so that's where we are now.
So as I told you before when we were talking, when I began to ponder on this story of Jesus walking across the water, the disciples seeing him, Peter calling to him, Jesus saying, "Come," Peter getting out of the boat and starting that way, and everything's looking pretty good. Then all of a sudden he gets distracted by the wind that's battering the boat, and his attention leaves Jesus, goes to the wind, and he begins to sink. And as he begins to sink, that's when he realizes he needs to call back on Jesus, and Jesus saves him. And as I thought about that story, this point came to mind. Our disappointments and failures can be opportunities to return to where we need to be. And I know that you have some stories from your own life that reflect on that very point. So would you tell us your stories?
I mean, really, my whole life has been right along those very lines. The way I was raised, I mean, I had wonderful parents, and my mother was really good to me in the sense of she really encouraged me to talk. She would listen to me talk for a long period of time and gave me the confidence to feel like things I thought and said mattered. So she was really good in that respect, but she was very ambitious too. So her idea, I mean, at first I was very into Catholicism, And so her idea was, someday you're going to be like the Pope. Someday you're going to be Pope. And then I sort of became an atheist at 13 and got really interested in science. So then she would say things like, someday you'll be like Einstein, you'll make discoveries as great as the discoveries Einstein made. So I internalized a lot of that ambition, in the sense of wanting my ego to be stroked and to be big and to achieve great things so that I would get admired by people. So then I went to college. I did really well in college, but as time went on in college, I realized, yeah, I'm pretty smart, but I'm not brilliant. I'm not going to be like Einstein someday. So what I settled on instead in graduate school was physics education. So I went to Chicago and the University of Chicago and got a degree in teaching physics, a master's degree in teaching physics. And I then worked at a Catholic girls' high school for 3 years, teaching math, chemistry, and physics. And I struggled at first to get control of the classes because I'm just not a very forceful person. But I figured out how to do it in the end. And teaching turned into this wonderful experience. I only did it for 3 years, but it was just a wonderful experience. And what was so good about it was I was helping people understand complicated things. I was forming really good relationships with people. And it didn't have to do with my ego being really big or good. It just had to do with helping people and communicating deeply with them. So the failure of not achieving what my mother had wanted me to achieve and realizing I never was going to, transmuted into something that was really much more significant and important: closeness, good relationships, helping others. Mm-hmm. So that was one experience in my life. After teaching for 3 years, at a Catholic girls' school, I was making very little money. So I felt like I needed to have a career where I would earn a little bit more money. So I started learning about computer things and found I was really good at it and really enjoyed it. So I started looking into getting computer jobs, and I got them. And one kind of computer job led to another. So in the end, I was making quite a bit more money than I had been teaching at the Catholic school. And I was really enjoying the programming and really liking it. But that sort of ego, wanting my ego to be stroked and boosted, resurfaced in that I started thinking maybe through writing I could write things that would end up getting me a lot of attention and a lot of admiration. So I started pursuing writing and really enjoyed writing, and I was good at it. But again, like in college, I was good at it, but not great at it. But I did produce some books and then tried to get them published. And in doing that, I realized I could go into a lot more detail, but I won't go into it now. But what I realized was I have funny ways of looking at things that's hard to communicate to people, and that it reaches some people but not big masses of people. So again, I had to come to the acceptance that what really mattered was reaching people, some people on a deep level, but I was never going to be able to do it in a way that would make my ego feel really good. Mm-hmm. So I gradually, I had mentioned earlier that I turned to atheism when I was 13, but faith kept reasserting itself in my life. So as faith reasserted itself, I started to realize that God was working with me in ways that I couldn't really understand. I couldn't translate it into terms of ego or intellectualism or anything like that. God was trying to make me realize that relating to people deeply is important. Compassion and love, sharing the suffering of others was important, and that suffering itself and witnessing the suffering both inside myself and in others was really an important thing for reasons that I couldn't fully explain, but that I was sure God understood. So again, having my ego desires defeated led to realizing that these other things were what's important.
Mm-hmm.
And that recognition, having others recognize you for things is not what's important.
Mm-hmm.
What's important is compassion, love, connection, and sort of letting God guide you into things that you don't fully understand where she's taking you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I know sometimes, as I've talked with people, when we talk about letting go and letting God guide, or especially if we use words like manage or things like that, that makes them very nervous, you know. What would you say to people who hear that and think, well, that I don't want to do that. I don't want to just let go and not take any responsibility, because I think that's what they're really saying a lot of times, of just not taking responsibility for ourselves, just letting God say it. So how would you clarify that for them?
Well, I think it is important to take responsibility and to try to be compassionate and loving. And like I said earlier, witness suffering in one's own life and other people's lives. It certainly requires thinking and action on our parts. But I've also found that over-controlling, when I over-control and try to manage everything on my own, it just doesn't work out like I think it should or want it to. And I've got to let go to some extent, while not abdicating all responsibility, and let God sort of direct how things work out.
Yeah. Another phrase you mentioned, the idea of witnessing to suffering. Can you talk a little more about that, what that means? And
it's hard to explain. I mean, to me, that's one of the essential things that I feel like God has brought home to me as a central purpose of my life. And I don't fully understand why that's important or where that's coming from, but I just feel like it is essential. So it's like, instead of turning away from suffering, which I want to do, it's looking into it, like staring it right in the face, and mine, as well as other people's, as well as the suffering of animals, the suffering of the whole world. It's important to grapple with that for reasons that I think have to do with, in the end, we learn that the things that God is teaching us are the things that are important and that will make existence wonderful throughout eternity. It really ties into the theme that we've talked about before. When I try to make myself happy according to what I think would make me happy, like having people think I'm great and things like that, it just doesn't pan out. And it causes more suffering for me, for other people. And it's important to see that suffering so that I learn through those failures that there's a better way, and that way is to let God make things happen, or inspire me in ways that guide me in ways different from the ways that I would do it. And it takes those failures as sort of constant reminders, not constant, but reminders that happen again and again through life, to pay attention to the suffering and pay attention then to what would really make me happy, which are those moments where I feel like God is interacting with me and where I'm connecting with other people deeply.
Thank you.